Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Jimmy Eat World, Surviving. Overall, this is a record where I was kind of interested to see what direction it was going to go in, considering that I felt like one of the teaser tracks for this thing, All the Way Stay, had some interesting ideas that it was playing around with. I did think that overall the track was kind of typical in some regards for the band, but I think it did just enough to, remain interesting. And also the fact that this album was going to feature the track Love Never that the band dropped last year on an EP. I was also kind of interested to see how they were going to incorporate that song into this new project too. And after listening to this thing a good few times, overall, I think this is a decent project. I don't think it's anything super special or anything. I don't think the band is able to really tie together as many kind of quirky or interesting ideas that I was hoping they would do based on some of the ideas that they played around with, like I said before, on All the Way Stay. But like I said before, this is still a pretty okay album in my opinion. It's definitely listenable. Some of the tracks on here are pretty catchy, and there aren't really any moments on this thing that I think are, that stand out as being particularly weak either. As I mentioned previously, one of the cuts on this thing that I think is among the stronger in the track listing is All the Way Stay. While for the most part this song is a pretty typical Jimmy Eat World cut, I do think the band's able to mix in just enough new ideas into this cut to make it worth a listen, especially the jazzier sounds that come into this thing towards the back end of the track. Again, not one of the most standout cuts that the band's ever written or anything, but it's just catchy enough and well enough put together, and it just has enough interesting things going on in it to make it a worthwhile song, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Love Never, that as I mentioned previously appeared on an EP the group dropped last year, is another one of the tracks on this thing that I find myself enjoying most. I did really enjoy the track when I first heard it in the context of the EP that dropped last year. Overall, it's a pretty fun, straightforward Jimmy Eat World song. It's pretty catchy. There's a good amount of energy brought to this track. All the performances on this thing just feel really solid. And once again, it's not like the most original song the band has ever written or anything, but it's pretty enjoyable for what it is. The outro to this album, Congratulations, is the longest song on this thing, being around 6 minutes in length, and the band certainly does take their time with this track to construct a song that feels a bit more developed overall. Structurally, this is definitely the most interesting cut on the entire project, and lyrically, I also think it's one of the standouts here, too. Overall, once again, I do want to say it's not necessarily like the greatest song the band has ever written or anything, but it does just enough to engage me. Outside of these songs, tracks like Criminal Energy and 555, for example, all feature pretty catchy hooks to them that are pretty enjoyable to listen to. And aside from this, I also really enjoy the fact that this album tends to have this very warm and cozy feel to it, I guess, would be the best way to say it. I don't know, this album just feels pretty comforting when I put it on, just with how it sounds and how everything is produced and put together. When it comes to complaints with this record, probably my biggest complaint here, something I've kind of alluded to quite a bit in this review up to now, is that for the most part this record isn't really doing a whole ton new for the group or anything. It's pretty standard for them overall, I would say. Never to the point of being too stale to enjoy, but at the same time not being exciting enough for me to really want to come back to it for future listens, at least as a whole project in the future. Like I said before, with some of the best tracks on this record, they do occasionally branch out and try some new ideas, just enough to stay entertaining. However, you all also have some songs on this thing like the opening cut Surviving, or Delivery, or Recommit, for example, that just feel kind of typical, maybe a bit too typical for me to really get into all that much. Furthermore, lyrically, this project really isn't anything super standout either. Like I said, the closing track to this record, Congratulations, is probably the song with the best and most developed lyrics, but even still, the lyrics on this track aren't anything super standout or anything. I don't know, I just get the impression throughout most of this record that the lyrics just aren't really the most detailed or impactful or anything along those lines. They're really just there for the most part because they need to be, and the vocal delivery of these lyrics is pretty good overall. They sound pretty nice when you're listening to the song itself, but there's not really too much for me to really dig my teeth into when I start reading along to the lyrics or just looking them over and trying to analyze them or anything like that. They're all just kind of standard once again. Once again, not terrible, not, bad or anything like that, just pretty typical and average, I guess. Overall, Surviving is a record where I feel like Jimmy Eat World is, doing just enough to remain entertaining to some extent, but not doing enough to be really engaging or making a product that I'm going to want to listen to again and again in the future, like I said before. There are some cuts on this thing that are fairly enjoyable, but even these highlights here on this record don't really compare to some of the highlights on the band's previous releases, or even some of the best releases, for example, on the band's last record, like Get Right or Through, for example. I do still think the best of this record is worth checking out if you're a fan of this band, but for the most part, unless you're a really die-hard Jimmy Eat World fan, I wouldn't say that listening to this record in whole is probably going to give you a ton of a new experience to enjoy or anything quite like that. Overall, this is a decent album. It's pretty, it's fun enough to listen to, I guess. It's pleasant sounding. There are some standout moments here or there on this thing, but for the most part, it just ends up being a bit too typical at times for me to really get super engaged in and invested in. But, yeah, that really sums up my thoughts on this record, I guess, and they are just my own personal thoughts, so if you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to drop your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. Once again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.